President Trump signing 2 executive orders aimed at narrowing access to birthright citizenship after the U.S. Supreme Court effectively knocked down President Trump's attempts to end birthright citizenship. One of the orders would end birth tourism. Effectively, the president, you heard describe it there, people who come to this country under the guise of traveling and then have a child here. That's how you heard the president and his top officials there describe it. Of course, the big question, will these 2 executive orders be immediately open to legal challenges? Will they stand the legal test? Let me go to Yamiche Alcindor, who's been watching along with us at the White House. Yamiche, before we get to those other headlines that President Trump made, weigh in on these 2 executive orders. And worth noting that the president said, while the United States is the only country that has birthright citizenship, in fact, 32 other countries have birthright citizenship.
That's right, Kristen. And right before the president started speaking, I got some new details from the White House specifically on these executive orders. Pardon me while I look at my notes here because you need them on a day like today. They're going to be for only future births tied to 4 categories: children born to foreign diplomatic staff working on behalf of another government while in the U.S. There's also going to be children of people who are classified as alien enemies, including those who belong to federally declared terrorist groups. There's also those born in the U.S. territories, but only, he writes, if Congress changes the law to end automatic citizenship there. Think Puerto Rico and other places. Also, children born of mothers who expressly and deceptively, the president says, enter the U.S. for the sole purpose of having children here. So this, as you said, is another attempt by the president to try to get at birthright citizenship. There is a second executive order that directs the Secretary of State and Homeland Security to issue rules and guidance to stop birth tourism, as you said, and target the industry at home and abroad. The president was very, very angry in June when the Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship. The president said today, when he was asked specifically, do you think that this is constitutional? He believes it is. You also had one of his top aides, Stephen Miller, reading from U.S. code and U.S. rules saying that he believes the president has the authority to do this. But, Kristen, this is surely going to be challenged in court, and this might end up back at the Supreme Court for all we know. What we do know is that the president was very angry because that decision was a 6-3 decision earlier this summer with Amy Coney Barrett as well as Brett Kavanaugh, 2 people that the president put on the Supreme Court bench, along with John Roberts, who is, of course, the Chief Justice, appointed by a Republican president. They sided with justices that were appointed by Democrats to uphold birthright citizenship. So the president very mad at that and very interesting now, and in some ways a little bit of what we thought was going to happen because the president was so angry in June when the Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship, Kristen.
Well, we will watch the legal battle unfold there. Yamiche, let's tick through a couple of the other headlines. The president asked about this reporting that he told donors that he did, in fact, want to see his vice president, J.D. Vance, become the Republican nominee. He was asked about that. He said, I think he's great, but also said it's way too early to talk about that, so would not confirm that reporting. He was asked what his message should be on the economy. He talked about the fact and made the case that he's improved the economy. He also claimed that he inherited the highest inflation rate. It's worth pointing out that when he took office, inflation was at 3%. It's now at 3.5%. So it's actually ticked up since he took office. He was asked if he's close to getting a deal on Iran. He said it could be soon, but also said he didn't want to weigh in on the details, said he would be open to lobbying any undecided senators on the confirmation of Todd Blanche, his pick, of course, to serve as Attorney General, including Lisa Murkowski, who has signaled she's a no on this. He was asked about embattled Congressman Max Miller, of course, who's facing allegations of abuse, which he denies, would not weigh in on that. He said, I do not want to get involved. And then finally, Yamiche, was asked about reports that the United States is actually dealing with concerns about its munitions stockpile. He said we do need more all the time, making the point that the United States has given a number of weapons to Ukraine, but also said, quote, we have a massive amount of munitions. Yamiche, what else stood out to you?
Well, I want to just maybe talk a bit more about that last point when it comes to munitions, because NBC News did have that exclusive reporting that the president himself called the deputy defense secretary and was angry about this munitions and the weapons stockpile, and at one point even suggested, a source told NBC News, that the deputy defense secretary should be fired if he doesn't figure out a way to fix this issue. So I think that that's very interesting to hear the president weigh in on that, because that is something that is definitely deeply concerning him, especially with the war in Iran continuing to drag on. One other thing that really pointed out, and that was interesting to me in this exchange with the president and reporters, is Dr. Fauci. A reporter asked him, should the Department of Justice prosecute Anthony Fauci? Dr. Fauci, who, of course, led the coronavirus pandemic response and was, of course, working for President Trump. He said, essentially, maybe he should be prosecuted, and pointed out that he believes that Democrats wrongly prosecuted other people. So I think we should also be watching that space very closely. As we know, lawmakers have at least moved already to vote to hold Dr. Fauci in contempt, and they've said that they would also give that over to the Department of Justice. So definitely a space to watch, because the president weighed in, essentially saying, yeah, he would be for that, which would be, of course, very newsy, given the fact that Dr. Fauci has been the face of a lot of attacks by President Trump and his allies. Kristen.
It certainly would be. The president arguing that his former top aides, Peter Navarro, Steve Bannon, of course, did face charges from DOJ. But it's worth noting Dr. Fauci did actually appear at the hearing, whereas Navarro and Bannon refused to recognize the subpoenas that they were faced with. Yamiche Alcindor, thank you so very much for sticking with us to break all of that news down. Really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.